Hey everyone, Tin Man here with a guide to my favorite build in Teamfight Tactics in patch 10.7, Mech-Infiltrators. I think this is one of the strongest builds when it all comes together, and it is much more flexible in terms of items than most of the other builds in the current meta. In this guide, I will cover the unit choices, ideal items for the important carries, the reroll strategy that is critical to this style of build, talk a little bit about positioning, and then the most important part, when to play this build, because blindly forcing it every game is definitely not the best idea. Okay, first the core units. As of course the name implies, we want the mech pilots, Annie, Rumble, and Fizz, along with infiltrators, Kaisa, Shaco, and Kha'Zix. The three mech pilots make up our front line, as the super mech can tank a lot of damage and deal quite a bit by itself. While that is keeping the opponents occupied, the infiltrators will jump behind them and start wreaking havoc with their high attack speed and damage output. Most of these units are low cost and can be found relatively easily early on, but Fizz is the lone 4-cost unit, making him quite a bit more rare than the others. Unfortunately, he is the linchpin in both mech pilots and infiltrators, so you really need to get him online ASAP. I will take him on the carousel regardless of what item he is holding if I don't already have a Fizz. The build is just very weak until you have one, so do whatever you can to get him as soon as possible. This build mainly just uses those 6 core units and only gets up to level 7 or 8 much later in the game, meaning that there are very few additional slots or flex picks. But getting to level 7 is going to be pretty common, and as a 7th unit, I like to put in a sorcerer like Lux. This gives the 2 Sorc bonus along with Annie, and just generally buffs up the whole team. Any sorcerer will do though. I prefer Lux since she has the stun, and most of our damage is going to come from the core unit, so the slightly higher damage output from maybe the other sorcerers is just not that relevant compared to the stun from Lux. Other options also include Valkyries to pair up with Kaisa. I generally think that the Sorcerer bonus, though, gives a bit more damage output overall when you compare maybe a 50% bonus damage against low health targets from the Valkyrie versus the always active 20% bonus spell power to your entire team from Sorcerers. I tend to pick the Sorcerer as a 7th unit, but Valkyrie is good for an 8th unit. Demolitionist is another good option. Ziggs can be used early on with Rumble before you find Fizz, but later on, if you somehow manage to get, say, a 2-star Gangplank, he can still deal a ton of damage even after his recent nerfs. Finally, if you do manage to find an Echo, he can replace Kha'Zix, but honestly, Echo is not that impressive without being 2 stars and without items, so I'm often pretty happy to just try to go for a 3-star Kha'Zix, since this build rerolls quite a bit early on. Now onto the items. There are 3 units that you should be thinking about suiting up with items in this build. Kaisa, Shaco, and then one of the mech pilots. For Kaisa, the best item bar none is Demolitionist Charge. She casts her ability fairly often, especially with Seraph's Embrace, so she will AoE stun most enemy units. This is just incredibly powerful, so you should always highly prioritize a Spatula if you're going to be going for this build. Other than these 2, any ability power items are going to be strong. Luden's Echo, Morellonomicon, or Rabadon's Deathcap are all going to be strong options on her. If you have a lot of Kaisas, make sure you pick up a lot of Tears and Rods on the carousels because those will build all of the key items for her. Next, for Shaco, he wants a lot of BF swords for his items. The most important one is Infinity Edge, since his ability makes his next attack a guaranteed crit, so IE will increase that damage dramatically. Other than IE, Bloodthirster or Hextech Gunblade will let him heal off his massive attacks, and then Guardian Angel will let him reset if he runs face first into the opposing carry and can't kill them off fast enough. All of these items do take swords, so if you have a lot of swords, make sure you really try to go for that 3-star Shaco. As for the mech pilots, you really only want to suit up one of them, since the super mech can only hold 3 items. Ideally, you suit up whoever you are most likely to 3-star. In most games, that will probably be Annie, since she's cheaper and more common than Rumble. But if for whatever reason you have a lot more Rumbles, or if you're even closing in on a 3-star Fizz somehow, then by all means, put the items on them. The best item is often going to be Quicksilver. You are really going to be putting 3 units into one with the Super Mech, so something like Zephyr or Blitzcrank Hook or just any other CC is really painful because it effectively is 3 times as effective against the Super Mech. Quicksilver makes sure that your mech will be in combat and doing its thing, and it also has pretty good tanky stats to boot. Otherwise, just getting good tank items is going to be ideal on the Super Mech. It has a ton of health, and so armor and magic resist items are going to be very effective at increasing the HP pool. Titan's Resolve is one of my favorites for the mech, since he's going to be your lone frontliner, and then it'll get a lot of stacks very, very quickly. Dragon's Claw, Bramble Vest, and Warmog's Armor are other great options, as is Guardian Angel, which will effectively trigger twice, once on the Super Mech and then once again on the pilot who then drops out of it. You probably will not have enough items to fully suit up the Kaisa, Shaco, and the Super Mech, so you should really prioritize getting the ideal items from the carousel for the units that you are close to 3-starring. If you don't think it's likely that you'll hit, say, Shaco 3-star, for instance, then you can deprioritize his items and focus more on Kaisa or the Super Mech if you're closer to getting them up to 3-star. Let's talk a little bit about the rerolling and gold strategy for this build. This build really peaks at level 6 when you have the 6 core units discussed earlier, so you really don't want to be spending too much gold before hitting that level 6. Focus instead on getting your interest up and just playing whatever you can in the early game to avoid losing too much life. Ideally, you hit level 6 on or before round 3.5, right after that carousel round. Between rounds 3.5 and 4.1, you should be a level 6 and rerolling your excess gold above 50 to try to hit 2 stars on most of your units and to find Fizz to bring the build fully online. Ideally, by round 4.3, if your rerolls went well, then you will have 1 unit up to 3-star, or at least be very close. This is the point where a lot of other builds are going to be leveling up to 8, so you really want to be hitting a power spike around this time in order to keep pace with them. By rounds 5.1 to 5.3, you should really have a lot of your 3-star units online and looking to level up to 7 or even 8. Stage 4 is really going to be the powerful point for this build. You should have your full 6-unit build with mostly 2 stars and possibly a 3-star unit, while a lot of the other meta builds are still trying to slowly level up, preserve their gold, and transition into a level 8 build. If you're still losing a lot during Stage 4, then something has definitely gone wrong, and it's only going to get worse from there as opposing builds come online more fully later on Stage 5. You really should not worry about losing too much health before that point, though. Just focus on getting up gold as much as possible. But if you are losing too much life, make sure you reroll down more, down below 50 gold, to try to hit those benchmarks discussed earlier. Another key point when rerolling is to know when to abandon a unit. In this build, you ideally can hit every one of those 6 core units to 3-star, but it's unlikely to hit them all. So you have to know when to cut your losses and free up gold and bench space for the other ones. If you don't have great items for them, like say you don't have a lot of BF swords for Shaco, then it might be wise to focus on Kaisa and the mech pilots instead. You might be too far away, say like you only have 1 or 2 extra copies by the end of Stage 4 after you've rerolled a whole lot, then it's pretty unlikely you're going to be able to find 4 or 5 more copies needed to get them up to 3-star before the game is over. So at that point you can just sell them off to clear up space and to get more gold. And of course, if a unit is heavily contested, like oftentimes Dark Star Jin opponents might be taking your Shakos, or another mech player might be grabbing a lot of Annies or Rumbles, then it might be wise to focus on the other units that are not quite so heavily contested. On to positioning. Here's an example with a graphic from lolchess.gg, a great website. Make sure to check them out if you haven't. A few important notes here. The Super Mech is going to be positioned up front because you want it to be hitting the enemies as quickly as possible. But sometimes it does make sense to move it further back under your backline to force the opponents to walk forward a step or 2 at the start of combat. It's better to place it further back to draw out opponents if you have a really strong Shaco, since he is all about that single target damage. But if you have a really strong Kaisa, then you kind of want the mech up front to keep the enemies in place and keep them stacked up close to get hit by Kaisa's AoE ability. Also, the infiltrators will jump straight ahead, so if you want to scout out your opponents, especially later on in the game, to see if they have an important carry like Jin or Jinx off to one side, make sure you move your infiltrators, and especially Shaco, to be directly across from it so that you can jump on that key target right away. In any case, Kaisa is often better closer to the center to maximize her AoE ability. If she's really far off to one side or the other, then you're kind of missing out on half of her effect. The last topic to discuss is probably the most important: when to play this build. A lot of players will see a guide and then just go straight into their next game and then just force that build without regards to whether or not it was correct. Instead, you should use guides like this to add to your repertoire of possible builds and then be able to play it when the opportunity arises. So what are you looking for in terms of signals in order to let you play this build? First, and probably most importantly, is that it is uncontested by other players. Since this build relies so heavily on hitting 3 stars, if multiple opponents are also taking your units, it's going to be very hard to hit them all and you will definitely struggle. Constantly scouting the opening rounds is very critical. If you see one other person going for this build, that's not really ideal, but it can still work if you have some good units and items already. If 2 opponents are doing this kind of mech strategy, then it's probably best to just forget about it. You really don't want to be one of 3 players in this strategy. There are just not enough units to go around. Depending on your items, you can transition into Rebels if you have good Kaisa items, since they will go well on Aurelion Sol or a Gangplank. While if you have better Shaco items, then you might be able to swap into a Cybernetics style build, since those same items work very well on Aurelia. If you do have an early Demolitionist charge, then you should definitely highly consider this build, since it is such an insanely good item on Kaisa. Otherwise, if you just naturally get some of the key units to 2-star, like Kaisa, Kha'Zix, or Shaco early on, or even if you get a Fizz from the Lilac Nebula Galaxy, where you get the 4-cost unit on the opening carousel. Since Fizz is so critical for the main synergies in this build, getting one right off the bat is definitely a green light to go for it, since you'll be able to hit a major power spike much earlier than normal getting those mech pilots online. That's it for this guide. Make sure you do like and subscribe. If you want to see more content like this, then do consider joining the channel. It really does help me out a lot. Big thanks to all of my supporters, especially my Lord tier channel members, John Vise and Abram Woodland. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you next time.